Rolling.
Hello everybody on YouTube, it's Rawze from Rawze.com, Rawze.com, that is. Somebody asked me the other day, I had to say it, yeah. Anyway, I got a KWT660 with a guy on my forum, came over to visit, and his engine runs like crap. It stumbles, it sounds like it's got some valve lash, just sort of doesn't run that great. I know a lot of people with these CM871 Cummins ISX engines, you know, they complain about that. So, he asked me to see if his injectors were any good. And we tried to do a cylinder cutout test, which I have a video for, it's really good, where you run the engine on one piston at a time. You know, you shut off all the cylinders except for one. And the engine will actually run on one cylinder at a time. And we tried to do that, and when we ran cylinder 3, or 4, 5, and 6, they seem to do really well. But 1, 2, and 3, it's almost like you weren't running on one cylinder. It sounded like it was running on more than one cylinder. And it kind of stumbled, and you know, you could hear some knocking sounds. So I thought, well, maybe it's bad actuator, because you know, you have, I don't know if you want to see this on the video, you have two actuators here. I don't know if you want to. Okay, and then you have a fuel shutoff solenoid that shuts the fuel off. You have two actuators here. Well, these two actuators, that one's the metering actuator, which I call the fueling actuator, and that one's the timing actuator. Well, this one controls how much fuel goes into the front 3 cylinders, and the front 3 injectors, and this one sets the timing for the front 3. Well, it does it individually, but you know, one at a time. But these two solenoids control the front 3, these two. So I thought, well, maybe the solenoids are bad. So we're going to swap those and see if it makes a difference, or maybe the back 3 starts acting up instead of the front 3. So that's an easy test to do. You can, you know, those 3 little T30 Torx bit, they come off. If you have to pull these off, they're very, very, very tight. It's easy to strip the Torx heads. So just use a ratchet and push really hard in on the ratchet when you knock them loose, so you don't strip one. But anyway, enough rambling. We're going to swap his actuators around. But in the process of that, there's a test that you can do to see if the injector is leaking. Because, you know, the engine's supposed to fire an injector, you know, fuel up, or put fuel in the injectors one at a time. And if you have, like, say, the check valve inside the injector, the little detent, or the little tiny check valve in the injector, it's leaking, it's not sealing properly, you'll load the injector up. This thing will load the injector up, and then when it goes to the next fuel, it'll bleed. When it goes to the next cylinder, it'll bleed back down, or you know, you get problems with it bleeding back down. So it's called injector leakage, and there's a way to check it. It's pretty easy. So we're going to do that in the process of swapping these actuators around. And I thought I'd make a YouTube video on how to check the injector leak down, or check the injectors for leakage. You can do the cylinder cutout test and run the engine on one cylinder at a time. But if the injector's leaking, if you have a leaky injector, it won't actually fire on one cylinder. It'll fire on 2 or 3 cylinders, and you won't be able to see very accurately how good the injector is. So if you really want to get a good picture of how the injectors are performing, you need to do this leak down test before you do an injector cutout test and run this engine on one cylinder at a time. Or you could just do one cylinder at a time. If it's, you know, if it's stumbling or anything like that, you should do this test. Anyway, to do this test, I have a special tool from Cummins. I think you could probably make one yourself. But what it is, it looks like one of the actuators, the metering actuator, fueling actuator. It's just a block of metal with a fitting on it and a little hose. And what we do, we take the actuator off, we take this thing and we put it on, we stick this tube down in this glass of water. I got this little glass of water here from the kitchen, and you do that, and you basically turn the motor over to see if, when the compression stroke comes up on each cylinder, each of the front 3, this is the front one, so you would do the front 3 cylinders, and then as you go up on the compression stroke, you can either bar the engine by hand, turn the motor over by hand, or I used to use a starter to see if you get any bubbles. And if you get bubbles, injector's no good. and how to see which of the 3 injectors it is, you have to do it by hand. You have to bar the engine by hand, and you have to see if you're in between A and B, or B and C, or C and A. And then there's a little chart on Cummins Insight, Cummins Quick Serve, and it is procedure. I have it here. 006-026. That's the procedure. Procedure 006-026. Signature ISX. Works for all the Cummins engines. And this part, this thing, is part number 316-4002.
Okay.
Got that? Alright. So, that procedure will tell you which injector is leaking if you follow the instructions. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to pull this off, put this on, and we're going to crank the motor. Now, I don't want the engine to start, because I'm going to use the starter. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm not going to do it by hand unless it leaks. If it leaks, then I'll do it by hand. So what I've done, if you can zoom in here, is I unplugged all of these. Unplugged them all. Every one of them. Okay? And we need to also unplug the shutoff cylinder. So let's do that. And then we'll install this. We'll put this on where the fueling actuator goes, metering actuator goes, and we'll crank the engine and see what happens.